evening to all sitting in different time zones attending the webinar. On behalf of our Truth Foundation, I welcome you all for this wonderful session on the politics of the climate crisis and climate change denialism. I have an announcement before we start that Dr. Naren Singh, who was supposed to join us as a moderator for the session, is not able to attend because of health issues. He is having fever since last few days and not comfortable to join us. He also went through the COVID test and hope it will be negative. We wish him a speedy recovery. But we are happy that we have our esteemed, renowned speaker, Dr. Gerald Kutney, with us. Before I formally introduce him, I would like to give a brief introduction about Earthroot Foundation. Earthroot Foundation was born out of necessity late in 2018. As we know that over the years, the monster of environmental pollution started engulfing cities after cities, countries after countries. The government, the policymakers, the think tanks, and the activists kept trying and assuring, but try did not seem enough, and the monster kept growing in size and threat. So that was the time we felt that no government, no institution, and no handful of scientists can tackle the problem. The need was felt that it is the responsibility of every citizen on the planet to act on his own and contribute his one bit to defeat this monster. But the bigger question in front of us was how will he do it? So some of the like-minded people comes together, brainstorm on this burning issue, and concluded that the common man does not know how will he do it, and thus was born Earthroot Foundation with a determination to let every human being know how and what he can do to save the Mother Earth from the clutches of pollution. We are basically working on four major issues like air pollution, minimizing usage of plastic, segregation of waste, and water conservation. Also, we have more than 200 volunteers around India and a few in abroad as well. And most of the volunteers working day and night, working hard. We also do some outdoor activities to aware people like plogging, tree plantation, cycling, etc. So this is all about Earthroot Foundation. So now I would like to introduce you our esteemed speaker, Dr. Gerald Kutney. Gerald is a commentator on mainstream media and social media on the politics of the climate crisis. He has authored the book Carbon Politics and the Failure of the Kyoto Protocol and is currently working on climate brawl versus climate denialism, the politics of the climate crisis. Gerald is also known for having inspired the popular hashtag on Twitter, hashtag climate brawl. On Twitter, he ranked in the top global influencer in climate science and forecast. And he is the #1 global influencer for education and public awareness in the climate change debate. He has a PhD in chemistry and is an elected fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. He was an adjunct professor at the University of Northern British Columbia and taught the graduate course, Climate Change and Global Warming. Now he is living in Ottawa. He has presented several guest lectures at Carleton University on climate change denial. A staff reporter from the Toronto Star wrote that Canadian researcher Gerald Kutney, who has wielded his PhD in chemistry like a blinding blade of science, in a relentless Twitter campaign against climate denialism. Yeah, it's very interesting. And he has published many articles in the mainstream media, like in HuffPost, Climate Samurai, National Observer, Porter Medium, Daisy Magazine, Happy News, etc. Also, he interviewed on Global News Radio, Irish Tech News, and also many people quoted him in the mainstream media, in the Toronto Star, Star, Inside Climate News, Sudbury Star, Windsor Star, and the Tree Hugger. So we welcome you, Gerald, for the wonderful session and hope that it would be very interacting. So I invite you to deliver the lecture. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Take two people. They have an average background. They have an average education. And they both have been exposed to the science of climate change. One person believes there's a climate crisis and we must take action. The other person becomes a climate denier. Well, why is that? The answer to that is rooted in ideology. Now, science denialism has existed since science itself, so it's not new. But climate denialism is special. And what makes climate denialism special is that it's so pervasive. There are tens of millions of climate deniers around the world. The world has never seen such denialism before in science. In the United States alone, there's over 100 million climate deniers. Why is climate denialism so special compared to the science denialism of the past? The reason is it has been inflamed by a propaganda campaign by major corporations that have never been seen before in history. They have hired the largest PR promotion firms to promote climate denialism and their propaganda. And they've been doing this for decades. And so you take ideology that has been inflamed by this propaganda campaign, and you get the climate denialism that we have today. And it's pervasive everywhere. It does vary from country to country, but very few countries don't have a large number of climate deniers. These people are denying science, accepted science. It makes no sense. Well, let's get back to the politics of the climate crisis. Why did this take place? Why has this been so pervasive? It can go back to the presidency of Ronald Reagan. He promoted small government and free markets. Markets were supposed to take care of themselves. And this enabled corporate America, especially the fossil fuel industry, to fight back and to fight back dirty against the science. With each Republican administration since Ronald Reagan, from George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, to Donald Trump, climate denialism within the Republican Party in the United States has grown more and more and more. I'm focusing on the United States because this is where it began. This is where the propaganda has come from, and this has had a huge influence on the rest of the world. Within American politics, climate denialism is so bad, so pervasive, that literally the entire Republican Party has become a party of climate denialism. That's all I want to say as far as my general intro today, because I really want it to be a question and answer period. You can ask me anything about I recently spoke about, things that you've seen on Twitter, things that are important to you about climate change or climate denialism. So on that note, I'll open up the floor for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Gerald. So those who have any question regarding the climate change and climate denial, so they can ask directly or into the chat box so that I can put it into the Gerald. So do you have any question regarding the climate change? So let me first start it with the Gerald. So Gerald, first I have a question with you that what do you understand or what is the difference between climate change and global warming?
That's a good question because people often get confused about why the different terms are used.
Mm-hmm.
Just a little bit of an historic background. Both global warming and the term climate change were becoming popular in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly among the scientific community, climate change is a more popular term than global warming. But from the popular press, they have a tendency to like to use global warming a little bit more. Why is that? Well, global warming is what it says. It's the idea that the that the world's average temperature is increasing because of the actions of us, mainly through the burning of fossil fuels. And there is a direct, serious impact of that. Melting ice sheets, rising sea levels. But a much more serious consequence of global warming is related to what it does to the climate. And so what happens is climate change encompasses what global warming means, but even more. How that warming influences the climate, changes the climate around the world. So generally, climate change is a more general and more better descriptive of what is happening. But global warming is a term that a lot of people just enjoy using.
Okay, nicely replied. So we have a question from Rohit Kumar. So he wants to know about sustainability. So how sustainable living can help us in tackling climate change?
Certainly in the longer term, it's essential. You know, with the world population it is today and our use of the resources that are available, sustainability has to be the intent going forward. Certainly, a more sustainable world will certainly help when it comes to climate change. Fossil fuels are not sustainable, for example, by definition.
Yeah.
But we need to react quickly. And so they complement each other, but we have to be very specific when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to the climate change issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so one more question we have that one wants to know that can artificial intelligence help in tackling climate change?
It should, but can it? I'm not sure.
Okay.
Certainly, we're in this mess because of humans.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe an artificial intelligence will be smarter than we are and can help us correct it. But that remains to be seen. Right now, the focus I have is what we can do.
Yeah.
And when we look at climate change, it has to be handled by politicians. It has to be handled by corporations. Without that, it'll never get done. Collectively, it's important to do things. But that doesn't mean as individuals, we don't have things to do. There's a lot we can do also as individuals.
Yeah, so one more question we have, how technology can help in managing climate change. So it is somehow related to, I think, AI or something like that.
Technology is a key,
Yeah.
but right now the focus is on technology that exists, not innovation and technology in the future. Now, I'm a big fan of innovation. I'm a scientist by training, and so I like to support innovation. But we're running out of time. We can't wait another decade for some great invention to come around that's going to solve climate change for us. There's enough technology that's out there today that's proven, and that is a technology we have to focus on short term.
Okay, so we have question from Brandon Caligari. So what sources do you suggest for people to be learned to be able to contribute, lobby, educate at a micro level? Example, local communities, neighborhoods, schools, local councils, etc.
That's a pretty good summary right now. When I look at individual actions, let's look at that overall. I break it down into three areas. One is that you act. You do what, take care of yourself. How can I reduce my own greenhouse gas emissions? How can I reduce them in my home? And then you look at your community. You know, don't worry about other people. Worry about what you're doing to begin with. Second is engage, and those are the actions that you went through. Participate. Talk about doing action. Now that's a personal choice. Personally, what I do is I spend my time on Twitter. Why? It's because social media is a huge echo chamber for that propaganda I was talking about earlier. And so every chance I get, I challenge climate deniers on Twitter. Other people, they're more activists. They will go for demonstrations and protest against politicians. That's another way of doing it, activism. And so there's lots of things we can do, and we should do what we feel comfortable with. The third one that we shouldn't forget, and that's because it is going to come down to politicians implementing the right policies to make this work, is vote. Politicians in democracies aren't just picked and show up. We pick them. So don't complain about the politicians. You vote for the ones that are going to make change that will help stop the climate crisis.
Okay, so we have next question from Sandeep Sen Gupta. He wants to know that will the use of solar energy be helpful in reducing global warming?
Well, solar is certainly one of the main options going forward. I often don't talk about solutions that much. If you're interested in the options that are available for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the IPCC reports summarize them quite well. You know, there's several options. And there can be some controversy over what the options are. Everything is a balance because there's a cost to doing anything. There's also a great cost of doing nothing, which we can't forget. When you're looking at options, look at what's best for your local area. So what may be best for one part of the country or the world can be completely different than it is somewhere else. The important factor is doing what makes sense to you, but makes sense there's material reduction in greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so as per your view, how Biden administration will influence transition of Kyoto Protocol to Paris Agreement?
Well, after the Trump administration, anybody would look good.
Okay.
But I have to give Mr. Biden credit. I believe he's off to a good start. I don't think at this stage he could have done a lot more, but we'll have to see how things go along. The greatest difficulty I've had with the American administrations, President Clinton, President Obama, and now President Biden, have tried to do major things to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But most of that has been through executive orders. And the problem with an executive order is it's very easy for the next Republican president to reverse it. And we saw that with Donald Trump. The group that's supposed to pass legislation isn't so much the president. It's supposed to be Congress. And Congress has done a lousy job at doing anything about climate change. I think you'll see a step change in certainly American politics if the House of Representatives and the Senate will at last stand up and they will enact some meaningful legislation. It's going to be tough in America. I don't know if it's possible, but that is the step change that's really needed.
Okay. So what is your point of view about the government in India?
I'm certainly not an expert in that area. The impression I've got from hearing from people, it is a little bit right-wing. Every country has its own challenges, and they're just not environmental, or it's just not climate change. If you look at the developing world, which is versus the emerging world, other things have to be kept in perspective. I remember when I was doing my review of the Kyoto Protocol, and something stuck with me from the delegate from China. He stood up and he said, you know, you guys in the Western world, you have luxury emissions, referring to greenhouse gas emissions. He says, we have survival emissions. And that stuck with me. Now, both China and India are not in that position anymore because both of them, I believe, are well classified as emerging technology or economies now, which is in the positive direction. But the point I'm trying to make is it's hard to compare different countries and say one is doing it right and one is doing it wrong. There are a few countries, and they are rare, there's only a small handful, they're actually run by blatant climate deniers. And that certainly fit the Trump administration. It fit the Morrison government in Australia, and it also fits the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil.
Yeah. So there was a lot of forest fires in the Brazil, and people blame the policy of Bolsonaro about. So what do you think about that?
Certainly from what I've seen, I think in terms of climate change, and that's what I focus on, not judging anything else, his policies have been disastrous.
Yeah.
You see what happens in Brazil, and these fires have been everywhere, right? They had them in Australia, they've had them in the US, they had them in Siberia. But when people seem to be doing things that aren't helping and are actually making it, it's one thing not to help. But when you seem to be enacting policies that make things worse, I don't know how people can do that. It just makes no sense.
Yeah. So we have a question that is cell-based or lab-grown meat a way to reduce carbon footprint of meat industry?
Sorry, could you repeat that for me, please?
Yeah. So is cell-based or lab-grown meat a way to reduce carbon footprint of meat industry?
When you look at, there's different sectors that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Fossil fuels are the major one and the ones that have to be tackled. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't do our best to do it in other sectors, whatever that may be. Whether it's agricultural generally, or it's, you know, whatever it may be. I don't think we should, you can't focus on something else and ignore fossil fuels. It's okay to focus on fossil fuels and look at other options. If you look about, let's say, more personal habits, whether you're talking about not just an industry, but our own habits, like our own, whether we eat meat or vegan or whatever the case may be, I stay away from that. That's a little bit of a personal choice. You know, I can be a strong proponent for climate change, but my world isn't perfect, you know? Where some people, I get in debates on Twitter sometimes, where someone attacks me, for example, for not being a vegan. I do have a low meat diet, but I am not a vegan. I don't find those sort of discussions helpful. The important thing is that I have my own path that I'm trying to do to reduce greenhouse gases. Someone else can have a completely different one. We all have the same goal. We're heading for the same destination. We're just taking different paths to get there.
Yeah. So is it too late to tackle climate change?
Definitely not. The one thing you have to be careful of is, and Dr. Mann in his new book, The New Climate War, focuses on this a lot. You have to be careful not becoming what's called a doomist. In other words, it's too late. We're all going to perish, or whatever it's going to be really bad no matter what we do. That simply is hogwash. When you look at climate change, the Paris Agreement starts by talking about trying to keep it within 1.5 degrees Celsius, certainly keeping it between less than 2 degrees Celsius. And the IPCC has done a great report on that. It's called the SR15 of how potentially you do that. It's going to be tough to accomplish that right now, but it is still doable. But the thing to remember, to a certain extent, those temperature levels targets are a little bit arbitrary to try to get people to take action. It's not that when we hit 2 degrees Celsius that, oh, well, we're here now and they're going to be stuck at it. It's going to keep on getting worse.
Yeah.
Until we stop. And so first of all, we never can give up because it will always get worse. That said, it's okay to say there's a sense of urgency because the longer we take, the more difficult and the more costly and the more damage will be done if we don't take action.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one more question we have, that how is climate change affecting farms and foods?
Farms are probably one of the most vulnerable areas to climate change, because when you look at whatever crop you're growing, it's been set to that climate that you have already. And so I'm giving you my opinion, not a lot about science per se, but in my opinion, agriculture is by far the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change directly, because it doesn't take a tornado to cause damage to a farm. Changes in moisture, in flooding, everything has to do with the weather has a direct impact on on agricultural industry.
So how, as an individual, I can contribute to tackle this problem of climate change?
I mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning to begin with. Remember, I have to be careful how I describe this, because I don't want to think it's not only an individual problem. In fact, it's not a major individual problem. The major problem resides with politicians and corporations. Now, we can influence those groups. With corporations, it's what we buy. We may be shareholders of a company, and we can be activists as a shareholder and saying the corporation has to do something. And I already mentioned with politicians, we vote. But what we have to be careful of is that we don't point at everyone else, saying, for example, it's China's fault, it's the oil industry's fault, it's Trump's fault. It's our fault too. There's things that we can do and we should be doing. So think about your own life first. What do I do in my own home? And you have to look at what you have the ability to do, which varies from person to person. But what you should be doing is thinking about, what can I do today? What can I do tomorrow? What can I do in the day after that to reduce my own greenhouse gas emissions? How can I convince other people to do that as well? You don't get mad at people, but you talk to people. Earlier on, at the very beginning of the presentation, I mentioned how the importance of propaganda is and how it inflames ideology. Well, how do you stop that? Changing someone's ideology is almost impossible. It's ingrained. It would take so long. I can't even think of even bother trying. But the other factor that's made it so much worse has been propaganda. That you can challenge. I do it on Twitter. You can do it around the coffee machine when you're with your coworkers. You can do it when a politician makes a speech and blabbers something about propaganda. Don't accept it. The problem with propaganda is when it's repeated again and again and again, no matter how obviously untrue it is, people start thinking it's true, unless it's challenged. And always remember, silence is an enabler of propaganda. So speak out against propaganda. It's a powerful tool that an individual has.
Yes, definitely. I think everyone should speak about the propaganda, either on social media or wherever they can. So as you know, that fossil fuel is limited and will be finished in next 30, 50 years. So how fast we should go for alternate sources?
We have to go as fast as we can. Now, that's a little bit of a cop-out. We can't just simply go cold turkey with fossil fuels. A favorite trick of climate deniers saying is, oh yeah, well, if we got rid of all the fossil fuels today, you'd be freezing to death in the wintertime. No one's suggesting that. And even politicians aren't stupid enough to suggest something like that. What we have to do is replace the burning of fossil fuels as fast as we can. Again, it's based on where we are and the resources we have available. And so some groups should be able to do a lot more than others right now. The important thing is that they do that. And so you don't compare yourself what someone else is doing or not doing. That's not fair and it's not right. Just worry about what you have the ability to do and implement policies as quickly as you can. One thing that's worth mentioning that is important for climate change is that regions put a price on carbon. And the reason you want to put a price on carbon, I always like to compare it to a sin tax. Like we have taxes on cigarettes and liquor and stuff like that. The whole idea is not to raise income for anything. It's to discourage its use. And so from an individual point of view, if you have a price on carbon, you can save money by finding ways not to use fossil fuels. More importantly, for corporations, it gives them a mechanism to justify investments to stop using fossil fuels. And the corporate world doesn't work because they're altruistic, but they're going to do this because it's good for the greater good of society. There may be a few exceptions, but I can tell you they're really, really rare. But corporations don't need to be legislated to reduce greenhouse gases. All they have to do is be given an incentive that they can justify the cost of doing that. And that's what a price on carbon will give you.
Yeah. So nowadays, everybody is talking about renewable energies. So when it comes to the solar, so where we will restore that electricity in the batteries, and batteries are having the chemicals. So what do you think that how we will handle that? There's a different kind of pollution we are creating for the future.
Anytime you look at an option, and we're talking about energy, but it plays with anything that involves natural resources, there's always some price to pay. And so whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's fossil fuels, whatever option you want to look at, there's no such thing as a perfect solution. So don't wait for it and don't look for it. That said, though, make sure that, as I mentioned, the IPCC reviews the major options for mitigation on the climate change front. I'm not quite sure the number they list in there, but there's probably a couple of dozen. In your own region, you can look at here are 5 projects that we could do. Which one should we do? You look at the one that causes the least damage longer term for your region. And so, yes, if something involves metal, there has to be some ore, there has to be steel manufacturing, or if it has concrete, there has to be concrete in it. Mm-hmm. The one thing that climate deniers will promote is they'll focus on the construction, whether it's steel or concrete, but they conveniently forget the major greenhouse gas emissions are not from constructing anything. It's from the ongoing fuel consumption for decade after decade after decade, which just dwarfs any greenhouse gases in the steel or in the concrete. Now, when it comes to batteries and solar, which are very important, you have to make sure it's done in a fair way. There are cases out there that there's horror stories that people have promoted. Mostly those are being promoted by climate deniers that may have taken things totally out of context. We have to do, again, take the option that causes the least harm. It's sort of like being a doctor, and the first rule of the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. Well, we're not quite that good when it comes to using anything for natural resources. So our motto should be do as little harm as possible. Keep in mind, though, once you made that decision, it doesn't mean that you don't want to do something better later on. But keep in mind, what is the improvement? That's what you really have to look at. And when you talk about something like solar that's connected to batteries and lithium or whatever the issue may be, the improvement is monstrous going forward. But what we want to do is for further innovation to do something better as the opportunity arises.
Yeah, definitely. We should look forward for the sources which can be helpful for the climate control. So one questions we have from S. Paliwal wants to know animal farming and its effects on climate change.
Yeah, this has been brought before,
Yeah.
especially cattle. Cattle comes up time and time again as being a source, and it is, by the way. I don't mean to demean it by any way, shape, or form. There's a lot more options. Again, when you look at the major cause, I got to stress this because people can become, what the fossil fuel industry wants to do is distract you away from them to somewhere else. And so it doesn't mean that you ignore areas such as agriculture, especially beef farming, but don't make it your focus. It lets them off the hook, and we'll never resolve the climate change without handling fossil fuels. Do what we can when it comes on the agricultural side. As individuals, we can make the conscious decision to eat less meat. I think that's a good decision, by the way. I certainly encourage people to do that. But it's not that the world has to stop eating meat. And from a practical point of view, that may not be possible.
Yes.
And so, yeah, look at cases where you can do, or you can encourage people to eat less beef if you want to. I think that's a good thing. But again, don't lose sight of the major issue here. The target is fossil fuels. It will be fossil fuels until we get a major reduction in their use overall.
Yeah. So one more question we have, how does the climate change affecting on health of humans?
I think that's a harder one
Yeah.
to evaluate. I've seen the odd study bring that out. I'm not quite sure how strong the science is on that. And I'm not talking about people dying from floods or from tornadoes or things like that. That's a little bit of a different area.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, the World Health Organization on their website, and this is a little bit out of date, we're mentioning that 150,000 people per year were dying in relationship to climate change. And again, I think that site on their website's like 5 or 6 years old. And so whether it's direct health or it's direct impact for other reasons, it's significant and it's going to get worse. If you're talking about general health, I'm really not sure. It's certainly something that should be looked at. These are things that usually take a little bit longer time to see any impact.
Okay. Yeah. So what are the main threats of climate change in near future?
The main traits of climate change in the future?
Yeah.
Climate change gives you bizarre weather. That's an easy way of describing it. Wherever you live. Now, wherever you live, you have weather that you're used to. And I'll give you an example here in Ottawa. In Ottawa, we don't get a lot of tornadoes, for example. We might usually get one every century, or maybe it's every 50 years or something. In the last 5 years, we had 2. Now, is that all caused by climate change? No, climate change doesn't cause a tornado. It doesn't cause a hurricane, but it does contribute to it. It makes extreme weather more frequent. It makes extreme weather more extreme.
Yeah.
And so when you look at what's going to happen with climate change in the future, whatever weather systems you're used to is going to change. We mentioned farms before. It's going to be more and more difficult on farms as we go along. Certainly the direct effect on global warming, we're seeing this with the major ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland. They're melting more and more, which is causing rising sea levels. Areas that are in low-lying regions are going to be more prone to flooding.
Yes.
A major problem is with the retreat of glaciers. that glaciers are the source of fresh water for a good part of the world. And so if they start disappearing, you have a greater problem of that taking place as well. The IPCC reports are sometimes a little bit difficult to read for the average person. They are more or less scientific reports. They're summaries, but they really outline well. And again, the one that's I mentioned before, the SR15, they summarize what the problem is of global warming as far as how the world is going to be impacted by it. And it's not a hard report to read. It's a relatively smaller one. I think it came out about 2 years ago. What's going to be interesting is next year, the AR6 comes out from the IPCC, which is the next series of reports on climate change that summarizes the latest science. And as with most of the IPCC reports when they've come out, this is going to shock quite a few people around the world about what science is saying about climate change and its impacts and what needs to be done.
Yeah. So I have a data that in the CO2 carbon dioxide, it is increased around 416 parts per million into the atmosphere. And the global temperature is increased by 2.1 degree Fahrenheit since 1880. And also Arctic ice minimum is decreasing around 13.1% per decade. And the sea level is rising 3.3 millimeter per year. Also, the data shows that ice sheets are decreasing 429 billion metric tons per year. So these are the scientific facts with the data. But still, we have the climate deniers. We are talking with the facts. So how do you tackle with those people who deny it when you present the data or you present the facts with data?
I've been challenging climate deniers now on Twitter for about 5 years now, maybe a little bit longer.
Yeah.
When I first started out, a climate denier would pop up a graph and say, this proves that climate change doesn't exist, or climate change is a hoax. This graph is usually, he got off of some blog site somewhere. It's not in the published literature. The standard response to that is, oh, well, here is a graph from NASA, or here is data from NOAA or the IPCC, hard science that shows that you're wrong and the science is right. What the climate denier does, he says, okay, here's another graph that shows you're wrong.
Yeah.
Okay, so you go back and now here's another graph from NASA that says you're excuse the expression, full of crap.
Yeah.
This is a game to climate deniers. They're not interested in your answer. They don't care. What there are is it's a game to them. It's like a game of chess. So they're thinking 3 or 4 tweets down the road because they know the type of stuff they've seen this a dozen times before. They've probably been doing this for months or years. And so why are they doing this? They want to make people think that there is a debate. There's no debate over the science of climate change. Zero.
Yes, definitely.
But the average person doesn't realize that. And so they're trying to imply that there is a debate. So what do? And by the way, sharing the science is still a good place to show that they are wrong. But for the last couple of years, I've taken a different tact. I put the onus back on them to prove that their science is right. Well, where did you get that information from? Show me the peer-reviewed article that states what you state that graph shows. Show me why that climate change doesn't exist from that silly graph that you just put up there. They can't, because there is no evidence to back up what they're saying. And so this changes the argument around. Instead of me being always responsive as they're leading the game, I put it back on them, and they have to defend their stupidity that they're tweeting right now. And certainly from my personal choice, that is an effective way of doing it. What I'm trying to do is discredit their information, and I'm trying to discredit them as well.
Yeah. So we have a question in chat box that climate change and global warming can be said to be consequence of development, industrialization, and emerging technology. For instance, what do you think could have been done differently from the beginning in order to prevent climate change?
Sorry, what has been done when to prevent climate change?
Actually, I repeat the question that she wants to know that climate change and global warming can be said to be a consequence of development, industrialization,
Oh,
and
yes.
emerging technology, for instance. So what do you think could have been done differently from the beginning in order to prevent climate change?
The use of fossil fuels, and it started with coal, was a paradigm shift in the global economy. And so when coal became a big deal during the Victorian age, the world was transformed. It had never seen development like this before, and it all started with the steam engine. And then petroleum came along. Fossil fuels themselves are actually remarkable fuels. They're packets of energy, and it comes in three states of matter. You have solid, which is coal, you have liquid, which is petroleum, and you have gas as natural gas. And so the use of these fossil fuels was immensely important to the world, and it's still important to the world. We didn't know about climate change until it started to come out really in the middle 1950s. That's when the science really became strong. And it took a lot of development. But go back to President Reagan, by the time we hit the end of the Reagan administration, the science was solid. It was accepted that the burning of fossil fuels would cause major problems. So we're talking about the late 1980s. Then we knew that something had to be done, and we had some time, but we had to take action or we're going to pay seriously for it in the future. The fossil fuel industry at that point had a choice. And that choice was to start withdrawing from fossil fuels over the next coming decades, or they could fight back against the science and fight dirty. And what they decided to do was to fight dirty. And that dirty fighting was that propaganda campaign that I mentioned to you before. What should have happened is certainly by the end of the 20th century, the fossil fuel industry should have been withdrawing and helping to find the future sources of energy instead of fighting tooth and nail to hang on to fossil fuels to the very end if possible. We are paying desperately for that now. Climate change should never have gotten to the stage it is at this point in time. And sadly, most of the fossil fuel industry hasn't changed. They're more careful what they say now, so they sound better with their greenwashing, but they are still fighting tooth and nail to keep fossil fuels going until as long as they can force it to be. So yeah, the question was an excellent one. And in my view, 30 years ago, we should have been where we are today. We seem to be hitting that point now that we're going to start getting some changes. But it's so sad. It could have been done over 30 years ago.
Yeah, you're right. So, how mismanagement or improper treatment of solid waste affecting the acceleration of climate change?
Yes, solid waste, especially organic solid waste. Organic solid waste itself is a major source of greenhouse gases from landfill sites. As it rots in the ground, it releases methane. When you look at what individuals can do, and again, this varies from country to country, one of the simplest ways from an individual point of view to help reduce your own greenhouse gas emissions is by recycling programs. The old 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. And now there's 5 R's, I forget what the other 2 are. But the point is, it also makes yourself more sustainable as you're going along. The recycling campaigns, the 3 R's, has everything going for it. Now, there are problems about how well you're recycling, but that's the last one of the 3 R's, right?
Yeah,
Reduce,
right.
reuse, recycle. And so generally when you talk about solid waste management, and then we start getting into plastics, which has a life of its own right now for a very good reason. It's a separate issue related to the petrochemical industry, and what we're doing as a world is an important one as well. And so something like the 3 R's helps so much as it goes along, because solid wastes are just overwhelming us all these days.
Yeah. So I would like to add something that at Earthroot Foundation, we are having a campaign of segregation of waste. As in India, we are not having the waste segregation at home. So our volunteers are trying to aware people about the waste segregation at home, so that if people segregate waste at their own place, so we can stop it reaching to the landfill sites and proper recycle can be done. So it is a big campaign we are running right now, and hope we would be succeed in this. So we have one more question, another said, how much growing population affect climate change?
So how much what population?
How much growing population affect climate change? Yeah.
Let's talk about world population. Just to, this is an issue that comes up a lot, and it's really, really important. And there are a group of people out there that are adamant that the root cause of our problems, climate change, sustainability, you can go on, is population. They're right. But the point is, what are you going to do? I'm not going to volunteer to bump myself off to control the world population. And so it doesn't mean that we don't have programs longer term to work on that. And I don't mean to demean it. The cause is a real one. But short term, there's no solution to this. Short term, it's not going to help when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, for example, or sustainability, or solid waste management, or plastics. It doesn't matter what you're looking at. They're all interrelated to the huge growth, because the growing population puts more demand on the natural resources of the earth. And whether it's seafood that's under attack, all areas are related to this. So longer term, it's an important cause to work for, but short term, it's not. There's no solution to it.
Yeah. So will taking action make our lives better or safer, or will it only make a difference to future generations?
Taking action, taking action is we're going to do immense improvement as it goes on. Climate change is a little bit of a tough one, and that's because you look outside your window, and you usually don't see it. Something may happen that has been influenced by climate change. And so it's been called the greenhouse gas has been called the invisible pollutant, because it's not smog, it's not soot, it's not a haze over the city. Those are all bad air pollution problems. But climate change, you can have a beautiful sunny day, and climate change is influencing your weather. And so it's something that someone else has to tell us is happening. You remember, climate change is trends in the weather. That's what the climate is, trends in the weather. And those trends are often a decade or longer. The average human being can't relate to that trend. We can relate if a tornado hits or there's a flood or something like that, and they're real as well. But climate change is basically trends in the weather. And so someone has to explain to us how those trends are changing, which makes it a little bit more difficult. And it's also why it's easier for the climate deniers, because they can throw out saying, well, look at here. It's the middle of April and we just got a foot of snow. How does that prove your climate change? That's a favorite trick of a climate denier. And of course, obscure weather still happens, wherever that may be. A daily event doesn't change anything. But at the same time, you have to remember climate change by definition affects all weather to to some extent, some more than others. But as soon as the climate starts changing, that is reflected in all weather events.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So how will measures to cut carbon emissions affect my life in terms of cost?
There is a good chance that it may increase your costs, but the one thing that people don't understand is what is the cost of not doing anything. There is a huge cost to not stopping climate change. I mentioned before about in Ottawa where we had 2 tornadoes in major ones within 4 years. The destruction of that were at least tens of millions of dollars. You have a major flood that takes place now, and climate change is partly to blame for that. The devastation could run tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, how many people have died because of it? And so nothing is free in life, and there may be some costs. But what politicians do who have good policies, the people that are most vulnerable to cost, they protect. And also keep in mind that the people that are most vulnerable to climate change are usually lower income. The rich can build their seawalls, they can go live up on mountain peaks or wherever they want to do. And so it's very important to, when you just see the direct cost, not to take it the wrong way. Let me go on a little bit what we've done in Canada recently. We have a price on carbon. It's been around for 3 or 4 years now. The right, the Conservative Party in this country has been adamant how, oh, you're hurting small businesses and lower income families. How could you be such an evil sort of government, as it goes on? Well, what we do in Canada, well, you have a price on carbon. So when I fill up my car, I'm paying so many cents on the liter, then it goes on this price on carbon that goes to the federal government. What the federal government does is I get a rebate on my income tax every single year. In the year before I spend the price on that carbon price. And so I'm getting money back. Now, if I use a lot of fossil fuels, that money won't be enough. But if I can cut back my fossil fuels and I'm less than average, I can actually make money on that price on carbon. And that is a type of a price on carbon that's called, I think it's called tax and dividend. And so essentially what it does, it's a way of allowing people to see, yeah, I can save money by not paying that price on carbon, but they actually assure that it doesn't hurt me. But I believe that most governments can set up a way that even though costs may go up for some reason, to make those changes to stop greenhouse gas reductions, of minimizing the impact on those that would be hurt the most. And always keep in mind, there is a huge price of climate change already. You're just not always aware of it.
Yeah. So how is climate change correlated with extinction of animal species?
That's coming up more and more. I'm not an expert on that area. Certainly, it's almost like the lower income people, cultures, and society are more vulnerable to climate change. The more vulnerable species, I think it applies the same way. In that the case that ones that are vulnerable to begin with, small changes in their climate can be devastating. When people look at how through evolution, how species adapt and species can migrate. So in other words, if it's too hot for you now, you can go further north or wherever the case may be. The problem we're having with climate change is that there's never been climate changes so fast as what's happening right now, which is beyond the ability of many species to adapt. And those ones that can adapt, and that possibly means migrating or whatever it is, they're in trouble. And so this is real. And so how many species are at risk, I really don't know. But because it's happening so rapidly, right, a lot of species will be at risk because of climate change.
Yeah. So one student have a curiosity to know that can roof farming be helpful in reducing climate change?
There are farming techniques that help. You remember, farming has come up a lot for a very good reason. Agriculture is a major sector for greenhouse gas emissions. It's not the most important one, as we stressed before, which is the fossil fuels. But there are things that, and face it, you're not going to shut farms down. They're critical. That's how we get food, you know? And so what you want to do is help farmers be able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so there should be government programs, not to punish farmers for greenhouse gas emissions, but for rewarding them for reducing it and helping them how they do that. I'm certainly not an expert in that area, but there's certainly actions that can be done for whether it's the farming techniques themselves, the crops they grow, the equipment they use of reducing greenhouse gases without causing food prices to go through the roof by any means.
Yeah. So one more question we have, that given that renewable resources provide only a small percentage of our energy and that nuclear power is so expensive, so what can we realistically do to get off fossil fuels as soon as possible?
Generally, let's look globally. If you look at the different sectors that are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, it's the energy sector that leads everything else. But we all use energy. It's essential to us as we go along. Some areas have done very good at reducing their fossil fuel use for energy production. And when you look at energy production, it's also special because it's the largest point sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which means that one facility is huge amount how much greenhouse gases are emitted. The most famous cases are coal fired power plants, some very large ones that exist. And so the ability to get off of coal as quickly as possible will have a major impact as it goes along. At the same time, energy is the fundamental of almost all growing economies. You need energy to power your economy. And so you can't, so no one's saying don't have energy growth. Do your best to reduce energy growth. Okay, energy conservation is a critical aspect of fighting greenhouse gases. And in fact, if you look at the history of energy efficiency in the world, and we'll take energy production as an example, it's been declining from 50 to 100 years.
Yeah.
And you say, oh, wait a minute, 50 to 100 years, that's before we even knew about climate change. Yeah, that's because people are trying to increase energy efficiency to save money. And every time you save energy efficiency, it saves you money. In the US and in the UK, that started around the First World War. And every single year, energy efficiency, or every decade, energy efficiency is pretty well increased. If you look at world numbers, energy efficiency has improved again since the 1950s in all countries. And so when you're looking at energy production, energy efficiency is the first thing to focus on. And again, it goes back to the same thing we talked about over and over again. Get rid of those fossil fuels as quickly as you can.
Yes, right. So one more question we have, that here in London, we had insanely hot summer, then late winter, then insanely cold winter, then very early spring, then snow again last night, and now it's getting hot again. I don't remember this variability. So It's obviously climate change. It's a very interesting question.
Well, you remember we were talking about before. The greatest symptom of climate change for people like you and I is bizarre weather. Whatever bizarre weather means, it doesn't matter. Bizarre weather is the prime example of climate change.
Yeah.
And there are series out there that shows that, you know, they talk about these polar vortexes, or whatever they're called, you know, that you get these huge spikes of Arctic air going far, far south. And so people that never got freezing temperatures suddenly get them. Yeah, it's all related to climate change. You say, what? How could global warming make things cold? Well, that's what bizarre weather does to you. And the thing to point out about global warming, by the way, it's the average temperature change around the Earth, not in any one region, not in any one spot. And so you can have a mixture of record heat and record cold all over the place. And that trend, and you can look at graphs from NOAA or from NASA that shows these changes in temperature. You watch them, it doesn't matter what happens in a month. There's lots of things, by the way, that affects our region's temperature. And so that temperature difference, remember that what's reported in those graphs is not absolute temperature. It's temperature difference versus a standard time period. And so what you have to look at is that over the longer term, and a year is even not long enough, you look over decades, every single decade, you know, for the last 4 or 5, wherever it is, the temperature has been steadily rising. And so that's what climate change is about. And that's that curve that we have to stop.
Yeah, and it's not only happening in London. Here in Delhi as well, in the month of March, we started feeling the heat waves. And then after a few days, we started feeling cold and sometimes very hot nights. So this phenomena is happening everywhere. So I think this is really the climate change we are facing, and people should not deny it.
Yeah, and as I said, it's bizarre weather, whatever is normal weather for you, wherever it may be. And again, overall, things are getting warmer. And the problem that we often have as individuals when we talk about this warming, it's not necessarily warming that we suddenly feel we're burning up because it's so hot. You know, we're talking about 1 degree Celsius so far, which to you and I means nothing. The temperature varies by 10 degrees Celsius every single day. But when you're talking about the entire planet, this is unprecedented. To change the temperature of a planet by 1 degree Celsius in a relatively short period of time is just unprecedented. And on that scale, it's scary.
Yeah. So we have more questions. I think we have time. So is it okay if we took more questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So would climate policies trigger a recession?
I don't see that happening.
Yeah.
You have to be careful. Politicians don't set out to destroy their economies. They may set out to destroy the longer term trends in weather because they don't care that much about climate change, but they don't destroy their economies. You have to be careful to do things that make sense for you. So if it makes sense to replace all your coal-fired power plants with solar or wind, where the case may be, good, do it. It doesn't mean that's the answer for another region as it goes on. And maybe they can do it, but they only can do 10% of it compared to what everyone else does. There's no one that's going to be, there is a cost to, in most cases, there's that cost for dealing with climate change. It's not meant to be a devastating cost. It's not meant to destroy the economy of a nation or a society. But at the same time, there's a huge cost of climate change that we're not paying attention to. And so it's something that has to be addressed. And there may be some small cost as it goes on. in the big picture, often it's so small. If someone wasn't telling you about it, you wouldn't really notice it.
Yeah. So if we stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at today's rate, so what global warming is stop? Would global warming stop?
The one thing that we have to look at different graphs.
Yeah.
There's the graphs of greenhouse gas emissions. As long as we have any, the global temperatures are going to keep on increasing. What we first have to do is stop increasing the greenhouse gases. And so we need that to plateau. Without that, it keeps on rising. But even when it plateaus, we're still emitting greenhouse gas emissions at that level. And so it's going to keep on increasing. And so what we then have to do is we have to keep on decreasing those greenhouse gas emissions and try to do our best to get it down to zero, which is a harder thing as we go along. And so don't be fooled by, if you look at the CO2 levels from Hawaii, that shows the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. They just keep on rising and rising and rising, and they're going to keep on rising. You know, this year or early next year, we're going to be at 420 parts per million, and that's the ultimate indicator. But the more preliminary indicator of that is what are our greenhouse gas emissions. And we focus on our own countries because that's how governments regulate emissions, whether it's Canada, India, or any other country in the world. We have to stop those first. But again, simply stopping the increase is just the first baby step to resolving the problem. It doesn't stop global warming at all. It just slows it down somewhat because we're escalating it right now.
Yeah. So we have a question from S. Paliwal. So she would like to know that in a vast country like India, for having ease in transport, having improved road infrastructure by cutting millions of trees, or use of fossil fuels in other transport like air transport or rail transport, which of these will reduce the acceleration in climate change?
In whatever region of the world you live in, you have to make sure you take care of your society. And there's only so much you can do wherever you are. Everyone's ability and resources, again, are restricted. The most important thing is you're always saying, how can I make it better? What can I do with the resources I have to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions? So no one's saying pull the plug on every coal-fired power plant and then you have blackouts across the country. That would be foolish. And so you have to work within the restrictions of what you have. But the important thing is have a conscious effort of looking at every opportunity and how can you create those opportunities in the future to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions. And that sounds simple, but people have to focus on that. And that's the real solution to resolving the climate crisis, is having governments that have a constant mandate to say, what can I do with under the restrictions of my country, my economy, my population to reduce the damages by greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible.
So what do climate models say about the warming that could actually happen in the coming decades? So this is a question, and I think you have tweeted about 1 or 2 days before about the climate models.
When you look at the projections for climate change, they're not predictions, they're projections. And the important thing for people to understand is that this is hard science, but they have to keep into account issues that are social sciences. And so whatever model you're looking at, as far as I understand, The impact of the carbon dioxide emissions are sound, hard science. But why do they have these different scenarios then? It's the other aspects that are unclear. Because what you're talking about is whatever CO2 is emitted, science knows very, very well what the impact will be on global temperatures.
Yeah.
But there's so many factors, so many different scenarios of what those CO2 emissions will be. They can, and they're more social related. They can be as, what have we done to decarbonize our economy? How our future energy investments are made in hydro instead of coal-fired power plants, or whatever the case may be. And so when you look at these scenarios aren't so much on the hard physical science side, which is really set well, but on the social science side and how society will adjust going forward. And that's why we get these different scenarios that you'll see from the IPCC, and you'll see it from NASA and some others as well, of why the future can look so different. It's not so much the hard science. It's more or less to do with us, how we will react to it going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have a question from Aishwarya, and she wants to know, given that renewable resources provide only a percentage of our energy, and that bucket power is so expensive, so what can we realistically do to get off fossil fuel as soon as possible?
It varies somewhat from region to region. And face it, people have generally used fossil fuels for energy production because they're the most economic way of doing it. And certainly if you go back 10, 20 years, there weren't too many renewable energies that could compete well with it. Hydro's been around for as long as fossil fuels pretty well. And so hydro, if you have the ability to do it, can be very effective.
Yeah.
But in the last decade or so, there has been a remarkable change in almost all renewables. Whether you're looking at solar or if you're looking at wind, they're no longer the super expensive options going forward. In fact, in many cases, renewable energy can be as no greater cost or even lower cost going forward.
Yeah.
You also have to, the one thing that people forget, there's also a huge cost of doing nothing. There's a huge price to pay. And so when you're looking at the economics, forget about everything else. Let's say we're just hardcore economists and we're going to figure out what we should do going forward.
Mm-hmm.
You have to look at the whole cost of not doing something versus what your options are. And the important thing is that not tomorrow, everyone just cold turkey stops using fossil fuels. That's physically impossible. But that every region has a conscious effort, every opportunity that you have, reduce your use of fossil fuels within the restrictions of whatever your economy or region has going forward. It has to be a conscious effort, and that's how climate change will be defeated.
Yeah. So is there any relation between climate change and the ongoing pandemic COVID-19?
I don't believe so. Some people may. It's an interesting comparison, though, because COVID-19 is very fast. It's happening in a very short time frame, and climate change happens over a longer time frame. I've seen a cartoon on Twitter, and they show COVID-19, and there's this great big wave that's coming over. But then there's another wave behind the COVID-19, and it's like 10 times bigger. And that's the climate change wave that's coming in behind it. And I think that sort of describes it well. So my own personal opinion is I don't think there's a direct, but both of them are learning experiences for us going forward. Once COVID is past, which hopefully we're getting close to that soon, we will have that behind us, but climate change will still be there. And the impact of climate change will dwarf in the longer term anything we'll ever see with COVID-19.
So we have question that is it too late to control plastic pollution? If we can control, then how?
Plastic pollution is a serious issue. It's a related issue, but it's not the same thing.
Yeah.
We've become a disposable society, and plastics especially. We have especially all these single-use plastics, which are just atrocious. It's such a waste. And so directly, there is not a relationship, in my opinion, between climate change and plastic use. But plastic use is, of course, related because they're mostly petrochemicals. And so they're coming from the same sort of industry. And they are also a major pollution problem that's growing immensely. That's incredible lengths is going on. And so it's another problem that the world has to address, which seems to be starting to right now. We're seeing more and more single-use plastics being banned, which is certainly a help going on. There's some recycling of plastics. Unfortunately, a lot of it ends up going to landfill and stuff like that. So there's a relationship, but at the same time, they're quite distinct between the two of them.
Yeah. So are climate change predictions reliable?
Climate change predictions are actually very reliable. And when we talked about this briefly earlier on, the science is solid. And so if you're talking about the most sophisticated computer models in the world. And if you say, well, what will climate change happen if greenhouse gases or CO2 hits 460 parts per million? The models can tell you bang on what's going to happen. And they're going to be right when you look at trends. You remember climate change? Climate is changes in trends in the weather. And that's why it's looked over as a decade or longer. A single event, it's hard to say, oh, it's all climate change. When you talk about trends in weather, yeah, that's what the climate is all about. But the issue with the models is not that the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be 460 parts per million. It's when will it be 460 parts per million? Well, that's a whole new ballgame. That you're bringing in what society is going to do going forward. Will it put in more renewable energy? Will it cut back on CO2 use from production from agricultural practices? Those are societal things. That's not hard science. That you're using social sciences where there's options going forward. So that's the confusing part about the models. The model part about the hard science, which is physics and climatology and all the rest of it, is solid. The scientists can predict bang on what's going to happen once you hit those parts per million over a decade, not over a day, not over a month, not even over a year. But they can predict generally what would happen over a decade because that's what the climate's measured over. But what you have to bring in is more social sciences, which are important. I'm not demeaning the social sciences, but they are the ones that are more flexible because they depend on what we do, what our government does going forward. And that's why in the climate models, you have these different scenarios, not different scenarios about the hard science about global warming. It's about the softer sciences. When are we going to hit a certain level of parts per million in the atmosphere?
Yeah. So what behavioral changes humans should adapt to face the climate change?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
So what behavioral changes humans should adapt to face the climate change?
If you're talking about adapting for climate change, I almost don't like that question because when you adapt, it means you failed because you didn't stop it. So now you got to live with it. Well, the problem is we haven't reacted fast enough. So we do have to adapt to what's going on. The IPCC reports are actually quite interesting. And for those not familiar with it, there's a standard report on the science, which if you're nerdy in science is a real interesting read. Next one's on mitigation. And the mitigation is what can we do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? The third one, which personally I don't like, not because it's not good science, it's because it's a sign of failure, is adaptation. Essentially, okay, we're stuck with climate change. What can we do to reduce its harmful effects? That's always a sad state of affair when you've let it go on that far. But it's really important. We have to look at how we can adapt as going on, because we've waited way too long. As I mentioned earlier on, we should have been doing this for the last 30 years. And now it's pushing us harder and harder and harder. And by the way, the fourth major report that comes out of the IPCC is called their synthesis report, which is the one where the political appointees have approved a summary for people to look at. That's a little bit of a different report. It's very important and it's got some very good recommendations, but it's been influenced more than the other reports. So yes, we live in a society where adaptation is important to climate change, especially ones that are the more vulnerable areas, which refers to low sea level areas, wherever the case may be, because there's more prone to flooding, to tide surges and that sort of thing. Small island nations are at greater risk going on. Adaptation is very important for these groups. But I hate to say it, adaptation is a sign of failure of society not to have adjusted already. But we're there, we have to do that. But mitigation, if you don't do mitigation, you're going to be doing adaptation forever.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, you are right. So we would like to conclude the session with two more questions. So will anyone benefit from global warming?
This has come up a few times. I live here in Canada.
Yeah.
We have relatively cold winters and snow, and people always, joke about that, a lot less snow, a lot less freezing temperatures. Isn't that nice? That there will be areas that the amount of freezing will be less, so maybe the growing season. So it's not that there's no potential advantages of global warming, but they're blowing out of proportion. Most cultures, most plant life, they've learned, and most animal life have grown to be used to the climate that they have. And so as soon as you change that climate dramatically, especially if it's as fast as we're doing it right now with global warming, there's no time for nature to adjust. So everything that's in that climate zone, if you change the climate zone, is at risk. So the biosphere is at risk. Your agricultural process is at risk. And it doesn't mean that if you don't look hard, you're not going to see some benefits going forward. But they are dwarfed by the downside. And it's called global warming because it's a global problem. There's no one country benefiting when the rest of the world is paying the penalty for it. We're all in this together. And so we have to look at this on a global basis. And so, yeah, you can argue whether there may be some small advantages going forward. They're not important because they're dwarfed by the serious consequences and the threats going forward. We've all learned to exist. If we're an animal, we've adapted to the climate we have. If we're people, our infrastructure and everything around us has adjusted to the climate that we're used to. And so you have a drastic change at that, it screws up everything. And so, yeah, there are some advantages to climate change. As far as I'm concerned, I hate talking about it because people will go off on a tangent when you have to look at the whole picture, not just one part of it.
Yeah. So one more question, do scientists agree on climate change?
Sorry, do scientists what on climate change?
Yeah, do scientists agree on climate change?
The peer-reviewed literature is very clear on the science of climate change. There are hundreds of papers every year. Maybe there's probably a few thousand papers per year at least on climate change. And if you look really hard, I'm sure you can find a small handful that don't agree. But that's not how science works. Climate deniers will focus on those odd papers that come out about how, we're overreacting, or And there are a few economists, by the way, well-known climate denier economists, that actually get peer-reviewed papers out of there to downplay the damage of climate change. The vast majority of scientists, and these have been studied, it varies. When people talk about the consensus of climate change, they're not talking about consensus of polling of scientists. They're talking about the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And the scientific literature is somewhere between 95 and 98%, showing what the damages are and how dangerous climate change is. The other few percent are often from the fringe that somehow have gotten through the peer-reviewed process. I can tell you one thing. If a scientist came out and showed that man-made, human-made climate change was not real, it'd be the greatest scientific discovery of the century. And the Nobel Prize would be the smallest part of the accolades that they would get. No one has done that. No one has disproved the bulk of the science that's out there in climate change. It's an accepted science. It's as strong as a science that any other science can be. And it's probably undergone the greatest scrutiny of any science in history. And it still comes through as being sound science. Why has it been scrutinized so much? It goes back to the original point we were making about all this propaganda campaign by the fossil fuel industry against science has been going on for like 50 years.
Yeah. So I think the vast majority of actively publishing climate scientists, around 97%, agree that humans are causing global warming and climate change. So thank you, Gerald, for such a wonderful and nice discussion. You have almost completed all the questions so far asked by the audience. So it was really wonderful to have you with us. So I extend my warm thanks to you. So I would also like to say thanks to our volunteers who work day and night to make it successful. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us in the discussion. Thank you, Gerald, once again. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed it. Hope you did too. Bye-bye.
Yeah, we did a lot. We enjoyed a lot and hope to see you again in some other discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay, now we stop now. For the audience, we have a feedback form into the chat box. So we request you to please fill the feedback form. Thank you.
Do you want me to leave the meeting?
Yeah, we can leave right now.
Okay, then. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.